this in his or her physical and social environment. So today is also a bit special because we're all welcoming two new CLEA members, Carol and Vinicius. They're here with us now, so they're helping with this event. And we're all looking forward to work with them in future events and future research as well. So I want to welcome to both of you and thank you for being here today. Okay. About the CLEA group, you can find more about us on the X Twitter and under the name CLEA Field. And so please follow us and so you can know more about future events like this, as well as the group's activities and so on. And if you want to know more about the group, you can also visit our website, clea.group. So, considering the well-established interest in foundational issues of cognitive sciences, we launched a series of events in which we invite speakers to help us tackle these questions. Our goal is to gather researchers interested in discussing the possibilities, the challenges, and the future directions of the cognitive and neurocognitive sciences. So questions like where is it headed, what are its main contemporary issues, and how and if we can handle them. Today, I'm really, truly glad to have with us Professor Frances Egan and Krys Dolega. So let me quickly present them to you. Frances Egan is a philosopher of science and cognition from the Rutgers University. She has held research fellowships at the University of Bielefeld in Germany and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and also at the University Bochum in Germany. In 2021, she was awarded the Goncourt Prize by the French National Center for Scientific Research. She's interested in the nature of psychological explanation, and her most recent work has focused on computational models of our cognitive capacities. Today, she's going to present and discuss elements of her just released book called Deflating Mental Representation, in which we find her take on the role of representation in cognitive neuroscience and in our common sense explanatory practices. We also have here with us Krys Dolega. He is a postdoctoral fellow working at the Center for Research in Cognition and Neurosciences at the University Libre in Brussels. His work is about computational models of cognitive functions, mental representations, and consciousness. Krys also works on other topics such as the psychology and epistemology of conspiracy theories, and is also interested in topics prominent in philosophy of computation, AI, and science, and so on. Now, today, Krys' role is to present comments on Frances' idea and, of course, present his own view while doing that. So that is so we can make a nice and friendly conversation about it. So this is how it's going to work. Frances is going to give us a talk. She'll have about 40 minutes for that. After that, Krys has up to about 30 minutes to make his comments and present his own view on the matter. And finally, Frances is going to have another 10 minutes to make a reply to Krys' comments. After that, we'll open the discussion to the audience, so everybody here will be able to ask questions for both Frances and Krys for about another 40 minutes, and after that, we end the meeting. So now, if everything is in place, we'll invite Frances to begin. So, Professor Frances, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. And thank you to the CLEA group for inviting me. Thank you all for attending. So I was originally planning to just talk about representation in computational cognitive science, but so that this isn't just a complete bait and switch, I'm going to start with a short overview of the book. The book, in fact, came out last week, so this seems like a nice place to kind of launch the discussion of it. So I'm going to start with, by the way, it's available free to download from the MIT Press website. Okay, so I will start with a brief overview of the book, and then I'm going to shift to talking about, there's too many topics in the book, so we can focus on kind of an argument and a developed view. I'm going to, after the overview, present my view on representation in computational cognitive science. So first, the overview of the book. In the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about any of these topics. So feel free to ask me about anything that comes up. So mental representations are states of mind that refer to or say something about things outside themselves. So for example, right now I can visually represent this coffee cup, I can think about Paris, I can think about Aristotle, I can think about the number 2, and so on. So we might wonder, like, how are mental states able to do that? How are they able to, how can I represent Paris? How is that possible? And contemporary philosophical accounts of mental representation posit a substantive relation, what we might call the representation relation, holding between a mental state and what it's about. They aim to characterize the relation in such a way that it picks out just the represented object and property and not lots of other things that might be in the vicinity. So lots of examples of these typical contemporary accounts: teleosemantic theories, causal or information theoretic theories, structural similarity, views that appeal to structural similarity, and so on. I'm going to say a little bit about these various theories later. So these accounts aim to characterize this representation relation while satisfying what's become known as a naturalistic constraint, and that is that the view makes no reference to anything semantic or intentional. Partly because that's what the view is supposed to characterize. What is the relation? So it can't build in any semantic or intentional notions. So I recommend a different approach from these standard philosophical so-called naturalistic theories. I recommend an approach that requires appreciating the role that mental representation plays in the various domains in which it figures, as an explanatory posit in the cognitive sciences, in our common sense practice of predicting and explaining each other's behavior, and in our ordinary thought and talk about perceptual experience. So in the book, I examine the role that the notion of representation, mental representation, plays in each of these domains. And I propose what I call a deflationary account, which is characterized by 3 general claims. So 1, construing a mental state as a representation does not presuppose a special substantive relation, what we might call the representation relation, holding between the mental state and what the representation is about. So a special relation holding between, say, a state of my brain and Paris or Aristotle or the number 2, and so on. So the deflationary view in all the domains in which I apply it doesn't presuppose such a relation. Secondly, content is not, on this view, an essential property of mental states. And by that I mean that the very same kind of mental state might have had a different content or no content at all. Now, this idea presupposes some non-intentional, non-contentful way of individuating mental states. So it's a burden on me to explain how these various mental states are individuated, such that the same kind of mental state could have different contents, or maybe even no content at all. Thirdly, content attribution to mental states is always pragmatically motivated. It serves to characterize, for certain uses and purposes, features of the mind that are not themselves intentional. Now, most generally, the attribution of content to mental states allows us to model mental states and mental processes. Mental states and mental processes are not publicly observable or accessible, but we can model them in ways that we already understand well. So that's the general idea. So as I put it, content serves to gloss these features for the intended purposes. So the common idea in the various domains in which it's applied is that content provides a way of modeling mental states for a variety of purposes. In computational neuroscience and psychology, aim to characterize the mechanisms underlying our cognitive capacities. Computational theories model the causal processes underlying cognition as mathematical processes. And that's the topic of today's talk. Common sense psychology enables the prediction, explanation, and regulation of behavior for practical purposes. It models the causes of behavior, that is, beliefs, desires, and the other propositional attitudes, as linguistic objects or sentences, and the causal transitions among the attitudes as inferences. And lastly, in our ordinary thought and talk about perceptual experiences, which is the last topic I treat in the book, aspects of the external world serve as a model for the purposes of sorting, conceptualizing, and reasoning about our perceptual experience. So that's kind of an overview of the various domains that I treat in the book. A couple of general points. The account is not intended to be revisionist about either science or ordinary practice, though I do challenge the standard philosophical interpretations of both. So it's intended to be faithful to what's happening in computational cognitive science and also in our ordinary practices. It's not, secondly, it's not interpretationalist or fictionalist about these domains. To be a mental representation on the deflationary account is to be a causally efficacious state or structure that's glossed as having semantic and intentional properties. And that's what I'm going to explain in the rest of the talk with respect to computational cognitive science in particular. So here are my aims for the rest of the talk. I want to unpack the role that representation, the notion of representation, plays in the sciences that aim to explain our cognitive capacities, in particular computational cognitive psychology and computational neuroscience. And secondly, to defend so in doing so, in unpacking it, to defend a deflationary construal of these sciences, according to which mental or neural representations are real states or structures that are given a pragmatically motivated representational gloss. So here's the plan. I'm going to start with some preliminaries so we can get a handle on, in general, on what representations are. Then I'm going to turn to computational models and talk about, I want to distinguish two kinds of representation, mathematical representation, because what distinguishes computational models from other ways of understanding cognition, so other kind of cognitive sciences, is that computational cognitive science characterizes cognitive processes as a kind of mathematical process, calculation, computation, and so on. So a second type of representation, the more kind of what we think of when we think of mental representation, is distal representation. By that I just mean representation of internal neural states of what's out there, what's out in the world. And that's typically what's meant by mental representation. Then I'm going to turn to one function of what I call a representational gloss. There are other functions, but I want to focus on one. And finally, I will briefly discuss an objection that draws a sharp contrast between my view and what I think is the most popular alternative. So that's the plan. So starting then with preliminaries, what are representations, just to get a fix on the topic. Some central examples, utterances, written text, maps, photographs, drawings, pie charts, graphs, and so on. These representations are all public. The central examples are public representations. So central to all of these examples is a distinction between the vehicle, representational vehicle, which is physically realized, has causes and effects. So for example, the noises that speakers make, marks on a page of text, on the one hand, versus content, which is the meaning or information conveyed, the message. Importantly, meanings aren't free-floating. They're anchored to or carried by states or structures of some sort, and these are the vehicles. So having content, thirdly, having content entails having correctness conditions. So representations can misrepresent. For example, a photograph might misrepresent Jack as being taller than Jill if he's standing on a box. A map would misrepresent Rio de Janeiro as being north of New York if the labels have been switched. So the idea then is that computational models, if they don't posit something like these central cases with these characteristic features, then there's no good reason to say that they posit representations. Now, of course, there are going to be differences. Mental representations are in the head. They're not publicly observable. They don't get their meanings in the same way as public representations, which get their meaning by convention. Our central examples get their meaning from something like the intentions of users. So the account of how mental representations is going to be different than that public representations. So turning now to our question, which concerns mental representations, computational neuroscientists use representational talk. For example, structures posited in computational theories of vision are said to represent maybe edges in the world. Neurons are said to represent elements of their receptive fields. So computational neuroscientists do use representational talk, but how should this be understood? Do computational models really posit internal representations? In other words, things sufficiently like the central cases I've been talking about in the relevant respects. And here are two possible answers to the question. One is probably the most popular view among philosophers, what I'm calling robust realism, following, I think, Bill Ramsey. On this view, representational talk is to be taken literally. Mental representations are as real as written text, maps, and so on. Second view, fictionalism. There are different varieties of this. On this view, representational talk is just a useful fiction, perhaps a metaphor. I'm going to argue that both of these views are mistaken. I'm going to argue for a third possibility. This is the deflationist view. And on this view, mental representations are real states or structures that are given a pragmatically motivated representational gloss. And I'm going to then now for the rest of the talk explain what I mean by that. But first, I want to turn to a short discussion of computational models. So one motivation for fictionalism is the idea that computational descriptions applied to human cognition, there are just metaphors. Minds aren't really computers. Well, to that, I would say that a computational description might be just a useful fiction. For example, some Bayesian theorists claim that their models are intended merely to systematize and predict behavior, not to describe how the brain actually works. My former colleague, Jacob Feldman, at Rux, just ignore that. That was his view. But if the purpose of the theory is to explain a cognitive capacity, that is to explain how the brain actually does something cognitive, then a metaphor won't do. So generally, then, the metaphor view I'm claiming is mistaken as an account of computational models. A computational model that characterizes a neural system as computing integration or vector addition purports to describe the actual causal processes underlying cognition. The brain, I'm claiming, computes the specified function in the same sense as a hand calculator or iPad does. Now, this is on the presumption that the theory is being offered as an explanation of a cognitive capacity, as with some exceptions, but as computational theories generally are. So one caveat, there's always a question about how much of an empirical theory should be interpreted realistically and how much should be construed simply as a feature of the representational scheme used to articulate the theory. So think about colors on a map. The colors may represent topographical features or maybe political boundaries, or they may just have a non-representational function, maybe just making the map easier to read. But the general point is that one needs to be careful reading the empirical commitments of a theory from its explicit formulation. And this point, I think, is particularly significant when considering the commitments of a computational theory to representation. So with this caveat on the table, my larger point is that computational models aim to characterize how neural systems actually compute, though some of the details at a given point in inquiry may not yet be specified. Now, I'm not, of course, there's idealization in computational models, and that's going to affect that. Again, that's going to, the amount of idealization is going to figure in how we're to understand the view. But my general point is that these views are offered as explanations of how the brain actually is cognizing. Okay, so this raises the question then, what is it for a physical system to compute a function? And I want a physical system, brain or computer. What is it for a physical system to compute a function? And I want to consider a physical system that computes addition. Now, this is going to be familiar to many of you, so let me go through it fairly quickly. Most generally, a physical system computes addition just in case there exists a mapping from physical states at the bottom, the P's, to numbers, such that the physical states, the P's here, are related causally. So P1 and P2 causes the system, when the system's in P1 and P2, it's caused to go into P3. Though the physical states are mapped to numbers n, m, and n plus m, related as addends and sums. The horizontal arrow at the bottom is causal, indicates a causal relation. The top dashed arrow specifies the arguments and values of the computed function. So when the system is in the physical state that's mapped to, say, the numbers 2 and 3, it's caused to go into the physical state that's mapped to 5, and similarly for other addends and sums. So a computational description is an abstract characterization of the causal organization underlying a cognitive capacity, and here it's the capacity to add. The relevant causal organization is characterized in a compact and perspicuous way. So that by relevant here I mean the causal organization that underlies its capacity, the system's capacity to add. It's characterized in a compact and perspicuous way by mapping physical states, for example, states of brains, to the function computed. For example, here, addition. Now, importantly, no physical system just adds. It does lots of other things, including maintaining a stable temperature. So for any physical system, there's lots and lots of causal organization there. What the mapping does is single out the causal organization that's responsible for the system's capacity to add. So we can ask, are there representations here? And we can see these P's at the bottom, the physical states, that are mapped to numbers to be representations of those numbers. But if we have a computational model of a cognitive capacity, and let's stick with addition, we want to consider whether the model, and we want to consider, does this model posit representations? Then we have to complicate the picture. So we need to move to a 3-level characterization of the system. So if the model posits representations, then there's going to be 2 mappings. The bottom mapping specifies the vehicles of representation. Here, in our addition example, they're going to be numerals. These are the S's in the middle, but generally they're going to be structures of some sort. The top mapping specifies the interpretation, what specifies their contents, what these structures in the middle represent. So the vertical arrows, let me say something about that. The bottom relation is the relation of realization. The top relation is the relation of interpretation. So I call the 2 mappings the realization function at the bottom and the interpretation function at the top. So the horizontal arrows, the bottom 2 are causal, with the middle one at a higher level of abstraction, and the top dashed arrow, once again, specifies the arguments and values of the computed function. Okay, so then two mappings, a realization function, the bottom mapping, which specifies the vehicles of representation. These are the eyes, structures in the middle, and an interpretation function, the top mapping, which specifies their content, what they mean. Okay, so then let's turn to, we're now talking about computational models. Let's turn to this notion of mathematical representation. A computational theory takes input and output states of the system to represent the arguments and values, respectively, of the computed function. So in our addition example, to represent addends and sums. I call this mathematical content. So the mathematical content is what the inputs and outputs of the system represent. And because the system is computing a mathematical function, the inputs and outputs are going to represent the arguments and values of that function. So some more examples. Perceptual systems compute smoothing functions. So for example, maybe the Laplacian of a Gaussian to get rid of noise in order to, say, identify edges. The motor control system uses visual and proprioceptive information to compute vector subtraction functions in enabling the organism to reach for an object in its view. Another example, the ocular motor system computes integration functions in keeping track of eye movements during saccades. So there are lots of examples. These mechanisms, I've taken some from different domains. These mechanisms compute well-defined mathematical functions, and their input and output states represent the arguments and values of the function. So the adders, inputs and outputs, represent addends and sums respectively. The smoothing mechanism in early vision takes as input intensity values at points in the image and calculates the rate of intensity change over the image. So it's smoothing a lot of extraneous detail in the image. Its inputs represent distinct intensity values, and its outputs represent rate of intensity change. The ocular motor system takes as input transient eye velocities and gives as output persistent eye positions. So inputs represent eye velocities and outputs stable eye positions. So there are lots and lots of examples. This is really the bread and butter of computational theorizing. Okay, now I want to turn to an objection to this account of mathematical representation. A number of people have presented this point to me. Marco Fachin is one who's written about it, but I think it's a pretty common idea. A physical system that computes a given function, according to the objection, say addition, can be interpreted as computing other functions as well. The causal transitions among physical states can be mapped to other functions isomorphic to addition for at least some part of its range. Now we could sit here and just think up all kinds of functions. So the point is that functions are cheap. There's lots of them. And the objection continues, then what do the physical states of the system really represent? Do they represent addends and sums, or the arguments and values of these countless other functions? The upshot then is that there are multiple mathematical contents. It's indeterminate what the input and output states of the system represent. So that's the objection. Here's my reply. Yes, a physical system can be interpreted as computing any number of functions. So I concede the initial point. What I call the canonical specification of the function computed is the one that does the best job of characterizing the causal organization underlying the cognitive capacity to be explained. Now, don't worry for the moment about this idea, this terminology of canonical specification. It's a simple, fancy word, but it's a simple idea. Some of the relevant constraints on interpretation are empirical, answerable to evidence about both behavioral performance and available neural circuitry. Other constraints are pragmatic. The function should not be too hard to understand. It must be tractably specifiable, and so on. Kind of in sum, the what I'm calling the canonical specification is just the interpretation that does the best job of satisfying these two sorts of constraints. And as with any scientific hypothesis, it's subject to this, the canonical specification is subject to revision if, for example, it fails to predict the system's behavior. That would be an empirical failure, or its application turns out to be too unwieldy, then that would be a pragmatic failure. So that's my reply to the claim that there's just too many functions. So what justifies picking one over the other possibilities? And my answer is that, well, the function does a job, and so the function that does the best job of this is the one that theorists will pick, and the functions subject to revision as any hypothesis is. But I want to step back and note that the dispute about representation isn't really about mathematical representation. That's not really certainly not really what philosophers are arguing about when they take different positions on how to understand representation, mental representation. They're not talking about mathematical objects. So turn now to distal representation. That's really where the action is. Structures constructed in early vision represent edges in the world. Place cells in the rat hippocampus are said to represent locations in local space. So in other words, theorists talk about states of the system, internal states, representing external distal objects and properties. And the question then is, how do these internal states get these external distal meanings? And there's been no shortage of proposals, but they typically fit the following model. The internal state it tracks in some sense or co-varies with its external object. And that's the basis of the representation relation. So the proposals aim to satisfy what's been called a naturalistic constraint. So the proposals must specify this tracking relation, the representation relation, and they must do so without referring to meanings or intentions. That's the naturalistic constraint. The motivation is maybe obvious, should be obvious in the context of computational cognitive science. Computational theories shouldn't presuppose the representational capacities of agents because that's what they're supposed to explain. And computational theories, a slightly different but related motivation, computational theories in particular aim to provide a mechanical account of thought, so they shouldn't posit any mysterious processes involving meanings. So let me say very briefly, just touch on the most popular candidates for naturalistic accounts of mental states. Causal-based accounts are also called information theoretic accounts. Examples are Dretske, Fodor's asymmetrical dependency theory. General idea is an internal structure means X if it's caused by an X, so it means edge, say if it's caused by an edge tokening in the world. So the basis for the representation relation on these accounts, it's a causal relation. And typically, there's lots of causes, so theorists will add further conditions that will pick out just the causal relation. Remember that an account has to pick out what the state is about, and not lots of other things that might be in the vicinity. A different kind of account are teleological accounts. On these views, an internal structure means, say, edge, if it has the biological function of indicating edge. So the meaning relation then on teleological accounts, the most popular ones is spelled out in evolutionary terms. So the examples are well known: Millikan, of course, others, Papineau, Nick Shea, Karen Neander, and in fact, many others. And a third possibility, structural similarity or homomorphism accounts. counts that appeal to the sort of relation that holds between a map and the objects and properties that it represents. So these proposals give different answers about the content of a given internal structure. They all aim to respect the naturalistic constraint, so they aim to specify just this representation relation without appealing to sneaking in any reference to meanings of the theorist or intentions and so on. But it's worse than just that they give different answers about the content of a given internal structure. Whatever tracking relation you favor, it fails to pick out a unique external condition. So even if you specify a single tracking relation, then the internal structure seems to have multiple different meanings. So the problem, I think, is most easily illustrated by reference to Letvin and colleagues' frog-fly example. They famously asked, what does the frog's eye tell the frog's brain? So simple example, but I think it clearly indicates the problem here that we get specify a relation. It seems like we get multiple candidates. So when a fly crosses the frog's visual field, it engages a mechanism that causes the tongue to lash out. An internal state of the frog represents the external condition, but what precisely is its content? What does it mean? What does the internal state of the frog mean here? So there are a number of candidates. Here are three. Maybe it means bug. It's typically bugs in the frog's normal environment that trigger the mechanism. Or alternatively, maybe it means frog food. The biological function of the process is to procure food for the frog. Or it might mean moving worm-like stimulus. Shape and movement seem to be important. Any moving worm-like stimulus triggers the mechanism, whether it's a bug or a frog food. So these proposals have been made by different teleosemantic theorists. Bug was Millikan's initial candidate. She switched then to frog food. That's also Sterelny's. Moving worm-like stimulus is Karen Neander, is the content that Karen Neander favors in her book. She in all of her in her earlier papers too. And Nick Shea's preferred content is kind of an amalgam of frog food and moving worm-like stimulus. I think it's moving nutritious object or something like that. So kind of an amalgam of two and three. There's a rationale for each of these. I mean, you can provide an argument for why bug or why frog food or moving worm-like stimulus is the content of the internal state. But the structure can't represent all of these things. Recall that a characteristic feature of representations is that they can misrepresent. But if the structure doesn't have a univocal content and so determinate correctness conditions, then it's impossible to draw a line, even a vague kind of fuzzy line between a correct application and an error. So think about the content, these content candidates. Each of the proposals draws the line between a correct representation and a misrepresentation in a different place. If the structure represents bug, then if a pebble engages it, then it misrepresents that thing as a bug. But if the structure represents moving worm-like stimulus, then it accurately represents even when it catches a jelly bean lobbed at it in the laboratory. So the question then is how to decide among these multiple contents. Excuse me. And here's, excuse me, here's my proposal. We get univocal content only by appealing to the theorist's explanatory aims and goals. The justification for selecting one content over the others is pragmatic. So let's go back to the content candidates. If the theorist's goal is to explain the frog's role in its environmental niche, then the theorist might say that the structure represents bug. Alternatively, though, if the goal is to explain how this mechanism contributes to the frog's survival and well-being, then she's more likely to say that it represents something like frog food. But thirdly, if the goal is to explain how the how the frog's prey capture mechanism works, then the theorist may say that the structure represents moving worm-like stimulus. Because if a bug or something nutritious doesn't present as a moving worm-like stimulus, it's not going to engage the mechanism. So the general point is arguments for these specific candidates are going to appeal to what the theorist is trying to do, her goals or explanatory purposes. So the upshot of all this is that theorists often use representational talk to characterize the causal processes described by the theory. But remember that there are too many possible contents. So the content they attribute is determined by the specific explanatory target, by the task to be explained, not exclusively by features of internal processes and the environment. Once content is attributed, I don't know what's happened, but why I'm losing my voice. Sorry about this. Once content is attributed, theorists can then, if they want to, partition the system's responses into correct applications and mistakes, that is, into misrepresentations. Actually, I should have said, if theorists want to attribute content, they can do so, and then if they do, then that enables them to partition into getting it right and getting it wrong. The upshot then is that theorists posit structures that play causal roles in cognitive processes. The structures can be glossed, as I like to put it, as representations. But a question is, why might they want to do that? Why do neuroscientists and psychologists use representational talk when they really mean causes or carries information about? And I'm going to focus on one reason why they might do that, on one function of a content, of mental representation, one function of content attribution. Central to our common sense picture of the world and our relations to it is that we represent the world. And in doing so, we typically get things right, but occasionally make mistakes. So that's a feature of our common sense way of thinking about ourselves. Our representational capacities, our cognitive capacities more generally, are the explanatory targets for theorizing in computational neuroscience and psychology. These explananda are typically characterized in intentional terms. For example, in organisms knowing the 3D structure of the scene or knowing the location of an object in view. Representational talk is the connective tissue linking the causal processes characterized in the theory and the manifest intentionally characterized capacities that are the theory's explanatory target. So the point that I'm making is we think of ourselves in common sense as representing the world, as getting it right typically and occasionally getting it wrong, and representational talk connects the account that in terms of mathematical and mechanical processes given by the theory with the way that we characterize ourselves and our relation to the environment in common sense, in our ordinary practices. So to cite just one implication of this, though it's an important one, neuroscientists and psychologists, when writing their grant proposals, need to make clear that their research addresses these explanatory targets. And so they use representational talk in articulating and developing their theories. They need at the end to show that they've done what they said they were going to do. Now, it doesn't follow, this is an important point, that the full-blooded intentional notion of representation is doing the explanatory work in the theories themselves. So deploying their thin causal notion, as I've been arguing, neuroscientists and psychologists can reconstruct the distinction between a successful application and a mistake without making use of representational notions, or indeed any normative notions. So think about the neuroethologist explanation of the toad. I'm switching now to toads because that's what the research is on, switching from flies, but it's basically the same idea. Think about what the how the neuroethologist explains the toad's prey capture capacity. T52 cells in the optic tectum are typically activated by a moving worm-like stimulus in the toad's visual field. That's where Karen Neander gets her her preferred content attribution that the thing is representing a moving worm-like stimulus. So their activation causes the toad's sticky tongue to lash out. So when there's a moving worm-like stimulus in front of the toad, it activates the T52 cells, and that causes the tongue to lash out, and the toad catches it. Well, often enough, in the toad's normal environment, the moving worm-like stimulus is a bug. Those are the successful cases. Occasionally, it's a pebble or a bit of dust, and that would be a failure. There's no appeal to representation in the explanation itself. The process is described in purely causal terms. But glossing the causal process in representational terms, as I like to put it, makes clear that the theory addresses its intentionally and normatively characterized explanatory target. That is the toad's success and failure at catching flies, at catching food. So I want to conclude by considering very briefly an objection that draws a sharp contrast between the deflationary view and the view that I call robust realism. So the objection goes, we should be realist about the posits of our best scientific theories, our best computational models of cognitive capacities, posit representations, so we should be realist about representations. They're just as real, it may be said, as electrons and genes. Here's my response. The deflationary view is realist about the structures that serve as representational vehicles. So place cells are real. But it isn't clear it's not clear what it means to be realist about content or meaning. Content and meaning isn't concrete, it's abstract. So I propose that we understand realism about content as the view that there are purely objective grounds for the attribution of content. And deflationism is not realist about content in this sense. Content is partly determined by pragmatic considerations, that is, by the explanatory goals and interests of the relevant scientific community. Now, this is not to refuse to take what scientists do and say at face value. So it's not being revisionist. It's not refusing to kind of defer to the scientists. The relevant explanatory interests are baked in, we might put it, when theorists make content attributions. The theorists don't deliberately think about what attribution would best serve their explanatory goals and then choose from an array of possibilities. Alternative contents are not even in the running. So for example, if the task is to characterize a given structure's stimulus conditions, then theorists don't consider how the state contributes to the organism's overall fitness. They just ask what triggers its firing. They're not thinking about the alternative because their theoretical activity is motivated by what they're trying to explain. The goals of the community of which they're a part. Okay, quickly, summary and conclusion. Representational talk plays complex heuristic roles in computational theories of cognitive capacities. Attributing content in the representational gloss allows us to see the organism's activity as accurate representation of the world and occasionally as misrepresentation or error. Normative notions such as correctness and mistake are confined to the representational gloss. The gloss gives us what we might think of as a rational overlay on the mathematical and mechanical processes characterized by the theory, an overlay that makes contact with our common sense conception of ourselves as rational creatures, generally successful given our goals, but occasionally subject to error. Let me just note that since content is not, I've argued is determined by the goals and purposes of theorists, but it's not in the theory itself. So the theory is naturalistic in the sense that I've been talking about it, in the sense that teleosemanticists and others want in an account of content. So we could say that what I'm calling the representational gloss kind of puts a human face on the mathematical and mechanical processes that are characterized by the theory. Thanks.
Okay, that was really nice. Thank you so much, Frances. I have a lot of questions for you, but I'm sure other people have a lot of questions also. It's been great. I will now invite Krys to make his comments about the talk. And so, Krys, if you're ready, would you like to share your screen?
Yeah, I will try to.
So I will just, can I just close this then? Is that the best way?
I believe you have to press the same button where you use to present, to share your screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Things have changed.
You can close this window. Oh, this. Okay.
Oops.
I believe
I'm sorry.
This can be, no problem. I believe you can just close it. Okay.
Okay.
Now
And
there's
now,
this blue lighted button
yes,
with an
stop
arrow up.
presenting.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, even better.
Okay. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, give me a second because I'm actually having now some problems. But Frances, thank you for a wonderful talk. Sorry, I'm having problems now. It worked before, and now it doesn't want to.
Do you think we can help somehow?
I don't know because it tells me that I have to, in the Safari menu, select settings for Meet Google and update the screen sharing option to ask. But I have it set to ask, so I'm very puzzled by this change here.
If you think there's there's an alternative. If you perhaps you want to send me, you can send me your presentation. I can share it for you if that's okay. Let me see. I believe Krys, is it still here?
Oh, I think he's entering.
Oh, okay.
I think it's related to permission.
Yeah.
Because I think you need to allow the permission to show your screen.
Yeah, but I'm not sure. We tested it before. We were doing it before we start, so I believe something new came up. But let's see if he manages to get this through. And if there's a problem, a harder problem, I can share it to him, so we don't have any issue.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear and see
you. Sorry for the trouble. I'm trying everything as I go, and I'm still getting the same dialog window, which is a little bit annoying, I must admit.
So if you click on the present now button, is it not showing what it was showing you earlier?
No, it's not. And in fact, it's not showing me even when Frances had problems and I was trying to see what the options there will be.
Perhaps we can work something out. If you want, you can send me your presentation and I can present it for you. So I keep switching the slides, so on. So if you can quickly send it to me and I just share it from here.
Right.
Perhaps that works.
Do you think I could maybe share it via the chat simply?
Share, sorry?
Could I just send it to you via the chat so I don't have to? No, I have to send it to everyone, I guess.
Well, you can send me to the chat or you can just email me. And if I have access to it. I'm not sure. Is it a PDF or is it a PowerPoint?
No, it's a Keynote file.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure I'll be able to handle that.
I'm really sorry, everyone, for the problem here. I really don't know what's going on. Okay. Could I maybe, if you don't mind, can I just quickly maybe close this meeting and I'll join again and we'll see if it works, okay?
Sure. Let's try that. Let me see.
Carlos, we're gonna Zoom next time, okay? I don't think this Google Meet's working fine. Should people here?
Sorry?
Let's Zoom next time.
Okay, I believe we should switch. Yeah, I also think that's a good idea.
Okay, I got it, guys. I've got it, everyone. Just need to reopen the talk and all right.
Okay, I'm seeing it.
Yeah, perfect.
That's
you
perfect.
Can see and hear, right?
Yes, I'm seeing.
Perfect.
I can see you, hear you, and I can see your presentation. That's fine.
Thank you so much for your patience and sorry for the trouble.
Don't worry. Whenever you're ready, you can start talking.
All right. So first of all, thank you for the invitation and thank you for a wonderful talk, Frances, and for a wonderful book. I titled this commentary Some Loose Thoughts on Deflating Mental Representation because, well, you will find out in a second. So I would like to start with a bit of praise for the book because I think Frances's book is really special because it completes a kind of an informal triptych or trilogy of positions on mental representations that have come out in the last decade. Those are Karen Neander's book, Nicholas Shea's book on mental representation. Now, Deflating Mental Representation, I think, is the third position that really defines the current debates on mental representation together with these other two books. And I believe that when we look back on this time in philosophy of mind, these three views on mental representation will be the views that will be discussed as most significant and most influential. And I also think that Frances's position, theoretical position, completes kind of or provides a viable alternative to the more realist alternatives that the other authors mentioned here have put forward. Now, for a bit of disappointment, I don't actually have a competing view to Frances's view on mental representation. I'm a bit of a fanboy, so I'm actually in almost complete agreement with her position. So that's a bit of a disclaimer for this commentary. Nevertheless, doing what philosophers do best, I will try to stir some problems and maybe raise some objections, not wholeheartedly because I don't entirely believe in them, but I think I will try to reveal some maybe ambiguities or issues that are present in Frances's position. And to do that, I would like to zoom in on what Frances calls theory proper. So on the deflationist view of mental representation that we just heard about, the theory is divided into two parts. The intentional gloss, that's the part that's getting deflated, and this what Frances calls theory proper. And theory proper is enumerated as having several parts. The first part is the mathematical function or functions computed by the mechanism or the system in question. Then there are the specific algorithms involved in the computation of those functions. Then there are the structures that the algorithm maintains, which I understand are largely specifications of the vehicles. And then there's the computational process defined over these structures and how they are realized in matter. So basically how the vehicles are implemented and manipulated in the physical medium. And finally, there's something somewhat mysterious that will be at the center of this commentary, which is called the ecological component of the theory. And I apologize if there's any noise in the background, but unfortunately my neighbors decided to do some renovations today. Okay, so looking at these 5 components, they relate very nicely to the familiar view of computational explanations offered by Marr. And this is very nicely and clearly outlined in the book. So the first component, the mathematical functions computed by the mechanism, and the ecological component of the theory are supposed to correspond to Marr's computational level descriptions. The rest of this view is supposed to correspond to Marr's algorithmic level, right? So obviously, specification of the algorithms involved in the computation of the function belong to the algorithmic level, as do the structures that the algorithm operates on, which is also very clear in Marr's writings. And the implementational level, so the lowest level of Marr's view, is somewhat lumped in to the 4th point. So that level kind of, that point blends the difference a little bit between algorithmic and implementational levels. I don't think this is actually any kind of deficiency. I maybe even think that this is a virtue of how Frances's view is laid out and presented, because it shows us that there is a certain ambiguity between the separation of in Marr's writings between the implementational and algorithmic levels. Okay, so what I'm going to be really interested in here right now is mostly the first and the 5th component of theory proper, the functions and the ecological considerations. I will explain what these points are in a second, but first I would just add another example of formal equivalence. So in the talk, we've already heard about the objection that Marco Fachin has raised to this view, according to which often on non-semantic views of individuation of computations, what computation a physical system is implementing is underdetermined. And this is an objection that really goes back all the way to Fodor's writings and his debates that he participated in on definitions of computation and computational explanations. I would like to provide a different example that comes from cognitive science, which is the example of the spin glass. So spin glasses themselves do not come from cognitive science. They are disordered magnets that show certain properties such that when they are, for example, heated up and cooled down, they can enter into an ordered state. And the very influential model in physics of the Ising model is supposed to be a model of a spin glass. A more recent Sherrington-Kirkpatrick model of spin glass in physics has made a big splash in cognitive science, and this is why I'm talking about it, because John Hopfield in the early 80s has simply used the Sherrington-Kirkpatrick model of spin glass in order to implement it in a neural network. And then these neural networks, referred to as Hopfield networks, have been successfully used to model different types of cognitive tasks, such as visual image completion, but also memory retrieval. So Hopfield networks have had a big career in cognitive science, and importantly, John Hopfield was one of the people who received the Nobel Prize last year for his work. And the point here is, of course, that the spin glasses and Hopfield networks are basically described by the same mathematical equation. So on a formal level, the mathematical function that these two systems implement is exactly the same. And this, of course, creates certain ambiguities. The reason why I'm bringing this issue up and I'm talking about formal equivalence again, even though Frances has already replied to this objection in her talk, is that I think that it shows us that the problem of functional equivalence shows us that the specification of the mathematical function is not the only thing that counts. There needs to be something else added into the picture when determining what function is being computed by a system that will help us build a full-blown explanation. And so just to go through it very quickly, if we look at the 5 components, what these systems have all in common are points 1 to 3. So the mathematical function is identical. The algorithm is also basically identical. And finally, the structures that the algorithm maintains are also identical. So the lattices in a spin glass model have the same properties, organizational properties, as the nodes in a Hopfield network. And so the computational process defined over these structures is likewise basically the same. Now, where they differ is very interesting because they differ, of course, in how they are realized in matter. So Hopfield networks are typically implemented in computers, whereas, or simulated, I should say, in computers, in digital computers, whereas spin glasses are, of course, supposed to be disordered ferromagnets. And the last point where they differ, and this is why I've stressed this before, is the ecological component of the theory proper. So let's look at this component a little bit closer. To quote from the book, the ecological component of the theory proper of the deflationary view of mental representation specifies general facts about organisms' normal environment that explain why computing the mathematical functions specified by 1.1 here, the formal mathematical functions, suffices in that environment for the successful exercise of the cognitive capacity to be explained. Here you can see that Frances has been talking about organisms, but I think that we could easily swap organisms for systems, for example, and normal environment for something more ambiguous like context. And this account would be equally well applicable to things like, I don't know, large language models, for example. Furthermore, the ecological component constrains and justifies the choice of function computed and the attribution of mathematical contents, right? So typically when cognitive scientists are trying to explain a certain cognitive capacity, they look at the context and in which that capacity is carried out and how it is carried out and so on. And this supposedly constrains and justifies the choice of the mathematical functions that are supposedly computed in order to realize that cognitive function. It also specifies relevant correlations between distal properties and the internal structures that the algorithm maintains. So what is meant by here is that the ecological component of the theory is also supposed to be responsible for creating some kind of relationship between the objects in the world that the system is responding to and the vehicles inside of the system that are supposedly allowing for the detection or some kind of maintenance of certain behaviors and so on. A typical example here would be edges and some kind of statistical properties of the visual signal. Statistical properties of the visual signal correspond with internal structures, but it's the ecological component of the theory proper that allows us to say that these statistical discontinuities are actually corresponding to edges in the environment. Oh, sorry. I seem to have lost this point. Okay. And finally, it provides support for the attribution of the distal, so the cognitive, intentional content to these structures. So basically, the ecological component of the theory finally is also responsible in part, and this is a question I will maybe have to Frances, how much work is being carried out here by this component of the theory proper. It carries out some kind of first steps in the ascription of intentional content to the internal vehicles of the system. So it's the first step in applying the intentional gloss to the computational functions that are carried out by the system. And if we look at all these points together, it suddenly starts to seem like the ecological component of the theory carries an enormous part of the explanatory burden of a theory of the theory proper that does the explanation, because, as I said before, it specifies the mathematical function being computed. So it tells us basically what abstract computations the system is carrying. It specifies the mapping between the vehicles of that abstract computation, or the digits, symbols in that abstract computation, if you want to call them that, and features of the environment. So it establishes some kind of relation that allows for explaining how something that supposedly happens inside of the system corresponds to the system's external milieu. And finally, it also, as I just mentioned, specifies or takes part in specifying the cognitive contents attributed to the abstract mathematical functions that are being carried by the system. So looking at all this work, it seems almost as if this complicates the supposedly deflationary picture that Frances Egan is trying to offer us. And the reason why it complicates this deflationary picture is because if we look at everything that the ecological component of the theory is supposed to be doing, the theory starts to look more and more like just standard realist realist representational explanations of cognition. And one of the reasons here is that when we look at how the mathematical function that's being computed is specified, and how the mapping between the environment and the features is supposed to be specified, and finally how the intentional gloss is established, an important question arises about the individuation of the mathematical functions. Namely that from the ecological component of the theory and what it's supposed to be doing, it seems like, on Frances's view, computations are individuated in a wide fashion, meaning that the way in which we individuate what computation is being implemented does not just depend on the facts, internal facts of the system, but seems to spill over into the environment and into the context in which the organism is operating, for example, its ecological niche. And in this way, if the specification of the mathematical functions is wide, then this view seems to be closer and closer to some kind of a realist conception of representational explanation. Because allowing for wide individuation, just makes it seem like this view is just a view of representational explanation proper, for example, that allows for some indeterminacy. Of course, I'm aware that Frances does not subscribe, for example, to the etiological account of function, but still, if we would look at how people like Tretzky or Fodor would account for many of the typical examples, such as, I don't know, the models of vision, and how wide deflationary view, let's call it, would account for them, these two accounts would seem to be extremely similar, at least in the way that they handle explaining a cognitive capacity in representational terms. Of course, traditional views, I don't know, information theoretical views like Tretzky's or Fodor's had larger aims than just providing an account of the explanatory practice in cognitive science. But I think if we would look and zoom in just on that, it would be very much similar. And so I would expect two potential objections to this accusation. One would be that the deflationary view does not aim to naturalize content or explain its origins. So precisely what makes the deflationary view different from many other accounts on the market is that it does not try to naturalize content or to explain where it came from. And I'm fine with this. I acknowledge this. And I think actually that's a feature of the view, not a bug. But as is specified in the book, providing an account of content and cognitive explanations does not require dealing with either of those problems. So if we would just look at how other realist accounts of representational explanation describe scientific practice, we would find that these two views would or could end up very close to each other. And the second response I would anticipate is that the deflationary account places special importance on the context in which explanations are made and the pragmatic interests of the scientist. And here I would, of course, also concede this point, but I would like to point out that the context in which explanations are made is just what the ecological component of theory proper is supposed to account for. So I don't think we can appeal to the context in this case to, for example, defend against the accusation that the view is committed to a wide individuation of computational functions. So the point of pushback would have to be here on the pragmatic interests of the scientists and how much they determine for example, the intentional gloss on the representational accounts. So looking at this, I think that there's a question of if we think of everything that I've said so far about the ecological component of the theory proper and how much it's supposed to do for the theory, there's a question of how much pragmatism is there left. So how much do explanatory interests, for example, as we heard in the talk, of the scientists themselves weigh into the explanations that they provide? And for this reason, I would just like to answer this, I would just like to go back to the example of computational indeterminacy. So imagine that you encounter a strange object in the desert of unknown origin, in this case, a monolith made out of some kind of metal. And interestingly enough, this is a real monolith in the US that no one knows where it came from. And scientists start to investigate it. And the question they're trying to answer, their explanatory interest, is actually very simple. What is it and what does it do, if anything? And so as they're investigating the composition and different magnetic properties of this object, they discovered that this object is actually behaving like a Sherrington-Kirkpatrick spin glass, and therefore it might actually be a very advanced alien computer. And of course, if two different scientists approach this object, one who is interested in metallurgy and another one who's interested in AI, and they look at the object and they try to interpret what it's doing, they might give us different answers. So one of them will say, well, it's a Hopfield network, it's a computer. The other one might say, no, it's a slab of disordered ferromagnets. I don't think that this is what we mean when we say that, or this is what Frances means when she says that the explanatory interests determine the interpretation of the explanation. I actually think that if we look at everything that is supposed to be provided by the ecological component of the theory proper, I think that there would be a definite answer to the question, for example, whether this object is a computer or whether it's just a disordered ferromagnet. I do agree, of course, that there would be some issues with determining, for example, the contents over which it's computing and stuff like that. But I think the question whether it's a computer or not would not be left to the pragmatic interests of the researchers. And so just to briefly wrap up what I'm getting at, perhaps a little bit chaotically, my main concern is that the ecological component of theory proper carries so much of the explanatory work that it threatens to collapse the deflationary view into just another version of realism about representational explanations. Admittedly, it would be a version of representational explanations on which there's a certain degree of indeterminacy allowed, and it would be probably also a view that stresses the importance of the physical causal processes underlying computation for carrying out a particular function or cognitive operation. But still, I think it wouldn't be that different from other views. On the other hand, I have also some additional concerns that go with this. So one is the concern that if we hold on to the deflationary claim, so for example, if we do claim that computational functions are individuated in a narrow fashion, then I think we face an opposite issue to the one I just mentioned. So if explanations are in the theory proper, if theory proper is what's doing all the explaining, then I'm starting to worry that it becomes a little bit unclear whether it is representations rather than computations that are doing all the explanatory work. Because it seems that if we remove concerns about explanatory gloss, it's actually computations that are doing all the work here. And one of my worries here is that Frances in the book has stated repeatedly that she is not interested in providing some kind of account of physical computation. But it seems to me that if she accepts that computational functions are individuated narrowly, then she might have to do that in order to defend the view from this objection. And finally, a third concern that is a little bit peripheral to the other two is that the account allows for multiple intentional glosses on the same computational explanation, but it does not admit multiple computational accounts of the same phenomenon, or at least that's the impression I got from the book. And I think that this is maybe a weakness of the view. This is somewhat unrelated to everything else I said so far, but this might be a weakness of the view because there is a growing concern in cognitive science that depending on the explanatory interests of the researchers, they might model the same cognitive function in different ways using different mathematical idealizations. And if that's the case, then perhaps Frances's view doesn't go far enough in being deflationary, because it still seems to hold to this idea that there's just one computational explanation for every cognitive function. But I'm also happy to be proved wrong about this interpretation of the view. Okay, sorry for rambling a bit. This is it. Thank you so much for letting me listen to the talk and for the opportunity to comment.
Okay, Krys, thank you. Thank you so much. Very interesting points. Now I'm going to ask Frances to make her reply. So Frances, you have about 10 minutes and then after that we'll open the discussion to the audience.
Okay, thanks, Krys, for some really interesting comments. So I get the main task you've given me is to justify this, what I call the ecological component. So you characterize it as doing three things. That it's one, it specifies the mathematical function. Two, it specifies the mapping between internal states and external distal property tokenings. And it specifies cognitive content. I would say it does two. It doesn't do one. It doesn't do three. So let me say more about that. Specifying the mathematical function. This is probably the trickiest point here. So Marr has, from the beginning, really stressed the significance of physical constraints. And so the ecological component, as I'm seeing it, comprises physical constraints and these correlations between what's going on here and what's going on out there. Those are the main components of the ecological of this part 5 of the theory. So the physical constraints play a crucial role in characterizing the function computed. And I think the clearest example of this is Shimon Ullman's work on structure for motion. So the theorist has to identify constraints or conditions in the environment that enable the cognitive capacity to be exercised, enable the system to, say, compute shape from motion, compute structure from motion. The theorist discovers, let's say, that objects are rigid in translation. So that's an ecological constraint that has the consequence that computing a very simple function, namely 3 distinct views of 4 non-coplanar points, which is pretty minimal amount of data, is sufficient to get the unique rigid interpretation. So what's gone on there? What's gone on is that the theorist has to investigate the environment. Theorist starts with a cognitive capacity, explain how the organism gets information about structure from the information that's available to it, is able to compute structure. The rigidity constraint plays a role in picking, well, I don't, be careful how I put it, but given the rigidity constraint, this pretty simple computation is sufficient for the organism to recover the structure of the scene. So the individuation is narrow. The function computed is specified independently of the environment. The theorist has to, it's kind of a context of discovery issue here, and Mar's pretty clear about it too, and I've been pretty clear about it in earlier papers, that the theorist has to investigate the environment to discover what the appropriate function computed, appropriate in order to do the job. So that's the sense in which the ecological component of the theory constrains and justifies the choice of the function computed. So in the Ullmann case, it's 3 distinct views of 4 non-coplanar points. The ecological component specifies that objects are rigid in translation, and you put those 2 together, the ecological component justifies that computing that function is sufficient for recovering structure from motion. So that's the way it works. Now, another component, the constraints aren't the only component of the ecological part of the theory. The other component is specifying saying what the theorist has to look and see what's going on in the environment, because she's trying to characterize the causal process. So what initiates it? What properties are instantiated in the subject's environment such that this internal state is responding to it? That story is going to be causal. But you have to start with, the theorist has to start with an investigation of what's going on out there. It's edges that initiate it. So this is a response to an edge tokening in the environment. That story is completely causal. Nothing about this represents that. That's part of the ecological component. So there's really 2 parts to it. There's general physical constraints, and those are going to justify the choice of the function. But the function itself is narrowly individuated. So what you get from that is a consequence that a mechanism that computes that function in this environment will be able to recover structure, but in a different environment where the rigidity constraint doesn't hold, it's not going to be able to do it. Same mechanism considered in different environments. In some environments, it'll be able to compute structure. In other environments, it won't. So the function's individuated narrowly. The ecological component justifies, given what the theorist is trying to explain, namely the recovery of structure, the ecological component justifies that the choice of that function, because it'll do it in this environment. So that's kind of the first, that's the sense in which the ecological component specifies the mathematical function. It does specify the mapping, or at least plays a crucial role in it, because part of the ecological component is to specify what's going on out there, what distal property token instantiations are going on out there. So that's your second job for the ecological component. Then you say finally that it specifies cognitive content. No, there's no attribution of the, it doesn't do that. What it does is, in specifying relevant distal property tokenings, it provides an objective basis for the attribution of cognitive content, but it doesn't traffic in content at all. It just says that this tokening of a structure in the organism's head responds to, purely causal, an edge tokening in the world. Now that's simplifying, of course, but it's a causal story. It provides objective constraints on the attribution of content, but it doesn't traffic in content at all. It doesn't. It's the pragmatic component that gets you from the theory proper's account of the causal process to the attribution of content. So there's objective constraints on cognitive content, but you don't get content at all until you bring in the pragmatic constraints. So you don't get the idea that this represents this going on out there. That's the first pragmatic move. The theory just says, here's this causal process, it's relevant. And adverting to the causal process is sufficient to explain the capacity without even going to the representational gloss. So I think that of your 3 points, that it's really only clearly doing the mapping. It's constraining and justifying the choice of a narrowly individuated function. And it's providing the objective basis for the attribution of cognitive content, but it's not construing the internal token as representing it all. Just it's responding to something happening in the environment. I don't want to take up too much time, so let me just say one other thing. You say that, on my view, representations aren't doing the explanatory work, that computations are doing the explanatory work. I don't get that, because I agree. Computations are doing explanatory work. So that's the source of the dispute between me and the fictionalists. I think they're absolutely in computational models. They're doing the explanatory work. Representations, not so much. Even mathematical content, there are objective constraints for it, but no objective constraints on all content, mathematical and content. But I could drop the talk of mathematical content. It was a simple way of focusing on the function computed. We can call we can say that the mechanism represents the arguments and values of the so I'm using representational talk there because I think it, but it's dispensable. Representation there is just the favored mapping. There's no representation relation going on between the vehicles that are tokened and some mathematical objects of any sort. Just a mapping. I think I'll stop there to leave some time for questions, but thank you for this. I did screenshots of your comments. If you could send me them, I'd really appreciate it. I want to think a lot more about what you've said. There's lots really interesting there.
Sure, thank you. Can I briefly respond before we go to questions?
If you want to make a quick response, sure. Just just ask you to make it quick because we're about to allow the audience to make some questions, and so
of course. So I just wanted to respond very quickly to say I actually agree with you on the narrow individuation point. I was grasping at straws a little bit because I wanted to fulfill my role as a commentator. I did want to point out, however, that you, at least in the book, and I lost it again, I was looking for it. You say that such correlations provide some objective support for the attribution of distant content to the structure of the intentional gloss. That's what you say about the ecological component regarding the last point, that it does play a part in specifying the gloss. And what I wanted to just to stress here maybe is that you're right. I should have put it differently on the slide, because you say that it constrains how the gloss is specified, but it doesn't do the specification of the gloss, right? So I completely agree with this. And just on the computational point, I think that this is like, I agree with you that computations are doing on the picture. On your picture, computations are doing all the heavy lifting. It's just that I can see someone who will say, well, okay, so how is this a theory of representation, in the sense that it doesn't, you advertise it as a theory of representational explanation, but then all the explanation is being done by computation. So I could see someone who is an activist, or maybe some kind of anti-representationalist, who would be happy to adopt your view, but as you just mentioned about mathematical content and the intentional gloss, just drop the talk of content altogether. Yeah, but thanks a lot for your replies.
Okay, good. Go on. We're not hearing you. I believe you're muted. Okay.
That's where the connecting back to our pre-theoretic or common sense understanding comes in. That's really all the explanatory punch of the gloss. I think that's important, but it's in a sense not essential.
Okay, great. Thank you both. It's been a great discussion. We have at least one question here from the audience. I believe Tobias Schlichtis wants to ask one of you something. So go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you and see you.
Thank you both. That was very clarifying. So I have to admit, I've always been struggling ever since I read the book where to place the possibility of misrepresentation. So now that was much clearer for me today. And it seems that, given the history of accounts that have been given, and maybe causal accounts, teleological accounts, you place it very uniquely somewhere completely different, right? In a way that you just said, if I understood correctly, and I have in the background, that's unfair to the rest of the audience. We were at the APA. There was a talk by Oren Shagri about possibility of miscomputation rather than misrepresentation. And there's lots of talk about this, but if I understood correctly now, of course, then misrepresentation comes in only later with the gloss, and that's related to the questions of the researcher of, that there can be only misrepresentation there. So if you have in mind the example that bugged Fodor, right, you're out there and then your visual system is triggered by a horse, not a cow, but then there's another representation. The false content was sort of triggered or produced. That was a problem. So you don't have that problem, but it seems that I'm not sure. So if the story is purely causal, so you're out there and your visual system sort of is triggered is activated. The vehicle, the representational vehicle, which is there, which is a mechanism, is caused or to go off or whatever by a cow rather than a horse and so on. You don't have to assume some kind of normal function of that mechanism, right? So it's just a purely causal story, you say, and then some computation of a certain function is started, right? And my question is that don't we want to say that there can be something going wrong at that point already, because the system is sort of led astray or something like that. So I was wondering, it may be because one of the points that Oron made was like, depending on the level of grain, how you specify the function, there can't be miscomputation because it would be simply a computation of a different function. So you can always have and then that would be the problem of the causal theory of content was that, you just cause something, it's a different content, but there's no mistake there because, you can just trigger the wrong. And so here the same would be, so it seems to me that I have to understand that some kind of, and it's not up to the researcher to say which function is computed, right? That's the story of out there in nature, in the brain, right? So there's a computation. I don't choose what computation is being performed, if I understand correctly. So I was wondering whether there shouldn't be a room for error in that at that stage already, and how you think about that. Because in New York at the ABA, you didn't seem to be bothered by his miscomputation problem at all. So.
Yeah, good. So what I said to Iran in New York was that what miscomputation is going to always be relative to the choice of computation. So the system can miscompute addition. It doesn't make sense to talk about a system miscomputing simpliciter. Like, what does that mean? So if you specify, it's analogous to the point about cognitive content. Specify here, in the representation case, you have to specify what the content is, and then you can characterize circumstances where the mechanism will misrepresent. Here, you have to specify what function it's computing, and then there will be circumstances where it returns the physical state that is mapped to 99 when it's in 50 plus 50 rather than 100. So now it's miscomputing addition. But the point is that, and the point I was pushing Iran on was that you don't get, you get miscomputation, but only relative to the specification of the function computed. And then you've got miscomputation, no problem. But the notion of miscomputing simpliciter just, I think, is incoherent. Does that address your
then there's never any kind of malfunctioning of any kind of representation?
Oh, there can be malfunctioning. So if you drop the mechanism in the bathtub, you know, all kinds of crazy things are going to go on. That's not miscomputing. It's not misrepresenting. It's just screwed up. It's malfunctioning. It's not going to do anything useful at that point. So you can recover all of these notions, but they have different requirements. Different things have to be in, certain things have to be in place for a system to miscompute and for a system to misrepresent.
But then, just to clarify, then what function is computed is also up to the researcher to determine.
To determine, yeah, and what function it's specifying the function that it's computing is playing an essential role in characterizing what it's doing and how it's able to detect edges or allow the system to explain motor control or whatever. So
okay,
yeah,
but that's also
that's
then in the eye.
Okay.
So yeah, so then there's no fact of the matter really that it's computing this or that function. Depends on my question to the system.
Well, there is a fact of the matter, but it's constrained by the task. So there's a fact of the matter about what it's computing when it displays behavior that's consistent with adding. There's a fact of the matter, it's computing some other function when it successfully reaches for the coffee cup. So the functions that are specified, the functions that the theorist looks for are going to be heavily constrained by the task that the theorist starts with. It's going to be computing lots of functions. This was the point when I said it's got lots of functional causal organization. It's doing like 100 things at once, and because we're complicated physical systems where lots of things are going on when we add. That there's causal organization there responsible for that, and some of those things, but probably not all, can be characterized in computational terms. That's an open question.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I believe Matt Lenz has another question for you. Matt, you can unmute your phone and please go ahead.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So my question pertains as to whether representationalism is the common sense view. The common sense view as the idea that mental states such as beliefs and desires generally possess intentional content, meaning they intrinsically represent things or states of affairs in the world. According to the intuitive view, when someone believes or desires something, there's a straightforward representational relationship. The person's mental states generally stand for or are about worldly things and conditions. This notion aligns with the ordinary intuition and everyday talk about the mind, where it's natural to speak of beliefs directly pointing to facts or states of affairs in the external environment. The common sense or robust view treats content as real, intrinsic, causally efficacious feature of mental states. Uh, you see content, but you see content as a conceptual overlay, uh, albeit a valuable one that we use to interpret and communicate what computational systems are doing. However, as I understand it, the naive view, or which might be different from the common sense view, and you can correct me if I'm wrong there, doesn't involve any kind of representations at all, but rather subjects with a sufficient set of capacities being situated thus and so, and having undergone such and such events, being able to appreciate directly their world. Content refers to what is expressed by linguistic or behavioral practices, the conceptual articulations of our beliefs, desires, hopes, fears, and other intentional attitudes in ordinary language use. Lying and hypocrisy depend on the feasible conditions. So, there's something about our behavior that can contradict, um, uh, what we express as what we truly believe. And the role of the sciences was to explore what renders this possible. So, what is the explanandum that representationalism is supposed to address? Does it change with a different account of our pre-philosophical or theoretical account? And how does your view account for the reality or unreality of potentiality, capacities, or and powers?
Okay, thanks for your question. There's a lot in there, more than I can deal with. So let me just focus on a couple of points that you made. Question about what common sense is committed to. I agree that common sense is committed to the idea that we represent the world, that we represent Paris and Napoleon and things in front of us. So representation, I think, is found in common sense. But I don't think that you gave a list of further conditions that you thought common sense was committed to. Intrinsic intentionality, having content that's causally efficacious. I think that goes way beyond common sense. I don't think common sense even talks about content. Common sense talks about representation and our abilities to represent, but I don't think content plays much of a role, and certainly not content being causally efficacious or intentionality being intrinsic. I think those are all views that are held by philosophers. Some of them I think are wrong, but that's another question. So I think a lot of that is sort of philosophical overlay on the commitments of common sense. So when I say that it's a constraint on the theory to address the common sense, explanatory target as given by common sense, really what I'm taking there is kind of the way that we pre-theoretically cut up our cognitive capacities. We see things, we reach for things, we can navigate around a room and around obstacles. That kind of sets the agenda for computational theorists to then explain how we're able to do those things. And those things are generally characterized in normative terms. We're successful at this. Generally, I can reach for the cup without knocking it over. Sometimes when I'm not focusing, I knock it over, and the theory has to explain the successes and failures. But the theory itself, I'm claiming, doesn't have any normativity built into it. There's no getting it right, getting it wrong kind of talk in the theory itself. There was another thing I wanted to add, but I can't remember what it was, so I'll just stop there.
Was there any particular evidence as to whether representationalism was intuitive, generally speaking?
I'm not sure what you mean by, I'm not sure what you mean. It's intuitive to a lot of philosophers, but others.
Oh, no, well, you said
just...
content was intuitive, but representationalism.
I didn't use the word intuitive. I don't think that content is something that the ordinary folk talk about, pay attention to. It's a philosophical notion, mainly. It's not hard to get get people to understand what content is, but I don't think that that's really the way that they think about what they're doing when they go about their cognitive lives.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Matt. We have 2 more questions to go. We had a bit of time, just a bit, but we do. So, Marco, feel free to make your question.
Yeah, my question is related to the bias question. It's just unfortunate it just left, right? And I want to understand the following. Representation, according to your view, seems to be, a gloss. So it's something that it's guided by pragmatic concerns, and it's something on the theorist side that it's, they somehow endow a whole theory with representation. So misrepresenting seems to be mostly a pragmatic thing, but miscomputing, that's the thing. So when we say that a system is computing a certain function, and we say that this function is being computed, what is pragmatic in this attribution? So miscomputing, is it just like misrepresenting? Does it have to do with what the task we are interested in and the kind of thing that we want to, see if the system is performing or not? Or is it, there is a fact of the matter, that's the real function that's being computed? Because in your example, the addiction function, for instance, if the system gives out the wrong result, 99 for 50 plus 50, is it performing this function, the addiction function, so it's miscomputing it? Or is it computing some other function, right, that actually gives 99? Because it's whatever function it is computing, it seems to be, there's always a function that you can attribute to the system, right? So
Yeah,
I just want to understand if both are pragmatic.
Okay, so this is kind of analogous to the Kripkenstein problem, I think. It's miscomputing addition, but it's correctly computing, I guess, this weird function that maybe gives 99 for everything above a certain addends. So that's why I think it's miscomputing. It's always miscomputing relative to a choice of function. So then the question is, what function is doing the job that we need computational theories to do? Which function is characterizing the causal organization underlying the mechanism's capacity to add? That's going to, this is kind of what I was talking about with the canonical specification. You start with, a job that the theory has to do. It has to characterize a particular cognitive capacity. Here it's addition. Addition should give 100, not 99, is the answer to 50 plus 50. You could imagine somebody, for some weird reason, cooking up some task that would require some of these really strange functions. And so relative to that task, there would be functions that would characterize the causal organization that's underlying that capacity. But it's hard to imagine that there would be that anybody would be interested in that kind of function. So again, functions are, there are tons of them. Some of them, the job of the function is to characterize the causal organization responsible for the capacity that you're trying to be explained. So that's a feature of the explanatory context. And the function is the one that best does that, given empirical and pragmatic constraints.
Right. Just one thing. So you think there is a representational gloss, but is there a functional gloss? Or you think, no, there's a different fact of the matter to the function that's being computed?
I thought when you said a functional gloss, you meant functional in the sense of the functional organization, which is the same as the causal organization of the system. There's a fact of the matter about what the causal organization is, or the functional organization is underlying our capacity to add or to reach for objects or to navigate.
Right.
And the job of the computational theorist is to specify that organization, and there's a fact of the matter about it.
So, excuse me, I think the question is, it's not a gloss like representation. There is something.
That's correct. Yeah, it's not.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Marco. I believe we have one more question from, I'm sorry, is Johan? Did I pronounce it correctly? Okay, Johan, you can unmute yourself whenever you're ready.
Thanks a lot to both of you. Excellent, presentations. And yeah, I have to confess, I'm also a fanboy of your framework, Professor. Like, yeah, definitely convinced. I wanted to insist a little bit about this problem of computation, triviality arguments about computation. But yeah, I guess it's clear that you accept this idea that somehow there's a pragmatic choice on the computational framework that accounts for this structural causal mechanism, right? That's correct.
Are you talking about the Searle Putnam sort of
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
triviality arguments?
Exactly. I was thinking of something like that. That if we are creative enough, it seems that we can project computational explanations in very different ways, and there's no fact of the matter that is going to help us in going, in computational explanation that is correct or something like that.
Yeah, that's not how I would respond to that. So the Putnam-Searle argument is intended to establish that, well, you specify the function, and then there's lots of other things like this coffee cup. We could specify you specify a function by a mapping, and we could characterize the physical states of this coffee cup so that it maps to the addition function, and that's supposed to show that the specification of the function, the computational specification, is trivial. And I don't think it does that at all. I mean, and there you have to look at the context in which the theorist starts with a manifest cognitive capacity. This system, I've observed this system for the last month, and it can add. It's got the capacity to add. So I want to specify the causal organization that's underlying that capacity. Now, this cup has displayed, I've had this cup for a few years, and it's never displayed any competence at adding or doing anything interestingly cognitive. Maybe I could, if we could specify perhaps by indexing physical states to times or something, or in some weird way, we could specify states of the thing that can be mapped to add-ins and sums over a range of the addition function. But what would that show? It shows nothing about the computational specification of the adder, the thing that has the manifest capacity. So everything in this room might be mapped to, we could enforce the mapping that has been specified to explain the addition competence. We could table the chairs in my computer. We could characterize a similar sort of mapping, but that doesn't have any bearing on the explanatory potential of the original case. Again, I can't stress enough that the job of these functions is to pick out a certain causal organization that is responsible for a capacity. That there's a fact of the matter about this. And the system that the theorist is trying to understand has that capacity, and the Searle's rocks and Putnam's, I guess it's Putnam's rocks and Searle's wall or something don't have that capacity. And a mapping pulling off, I mean, it's interesting. You could waste your time doing that, but it doesn't show anything about whether this causal organization is capable of doing this job. And so that's the sense in which these triviality arguments ignore the context in which scientists are actually working, trying to provide explanations of cognition.
Yeah, super quickly, can you add something? Yeah, I'm trying to apply, as I was saying, your framework to this problem in AI particularly. I know you focus on human psychology, neuroscience, but there seems to be this current project of doing, let's say, mechanistic interpretability. So trying to attribute, let's say, intentional contents to systems grounded on these, computational facts, let's say. do you think that is legitimate somehow? So we have this brute fact apparently of a cognitive capacity, and then we try to find the mechanistic computational facts that sufficiently correlate with that ability, or do you think it's just something completely?
Well, I mean, it's very, very difficult. I mean, it's going to be hard to come up with the computational goods on AIs that can do anything interesting, like ChatGPT-4 and so on. In the meantime, I guess there may be a certain point to trying to going kind of Dennettian on the system and trying to interpret its behavior by attributing intentional contents. But there's what we'd like to see is a specification of the internal states of the system and how it's organized, of its causal organization. And the problem is that's horribly complicated. But that's what the kind of the project would look like. And in the meantime, there might be a rationale for kind of just interpreting it in the Dennettian sense to make sense of its behavior. But there should be no, thought that that's explaining what it's doing. It's merely systematizing and perhaps predicting.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Johan. Well, I believe that's it. I think we're reaching now the end of our meeting. I want to thank again both Frances, Krys, all the participants. Such a wonderful conversation. I'm sure it was useful and interesting for all of us who work around this topic, and I'm sure it will be useful to many with the recording as well. By the way, I'm going to stop the recording now. So,
I'd just like to thank everyone. This is going to be, it's very useful for me too. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Krys.
Oh, thank you for having me as a commentator. Thanks a lot, Frances, for a great talk. And for the invitation, Carlos and others.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's good to have you here. So I'm going to record now.